All right, YouTube, it's time to talk about Russia again because it seems that things aren't going quite as Putin planned, or maybe they are. The ruble is continuing to collapse. Oil prices have now hit probably what they will bottom out as for at least some time, but it doesn't look good for the Russian economy because here's one thing people need to understand. Russia's economy is relatively fragile anyway and relies mostly on fuel exports. That's like half of their economy, and a large proportion of that is oil. So when oil prices drop substantially, it's a similar effect to what you would see in some tin horn dictatorship that relies upon oil exports for its own existence. There's not as much meat and bones in the economy other than oil that they can really fall back on to export. And here, the sad thing is this. Russia had been moving closer and closer to sort of joining the European community, not necessarily on a cultural basis, which is something I think some people support Russia on, including myself. But economically, it had been moving closer to sort of integrating with the rest of the world and actually using its resources to prop up its own economy, to build infrastructure and so forth. And now it looks like in the current state of affairs, Putin's not actually going to be capable of really expanding the economy and his military, by the way that he wanted, to the point where China has largely eclipsed Russia as the sort of runner-up within the world economy. It's now technically larger than the U.S. economy, although the per capita amount of income is far, far lower, the per capita amount of production. So really, Putin has overseen, essentially, instead of the growth of Russia back into sort of a major player in the world, one which can claim that it's sort of number two or tied for first place like it was in the days of the USSR, has instead seen his economy slide backwards substantially. Literally over the course of only a single year, it's contracted substantially. Anyone, for instance, if you go online, and it doesn't matter whether it's a media site, a chat room, wherever it happens to be, you'll meet a lot of people who, and they're largely paid posters in Central Asia, places like Pakistan or whatever, who get paid literally by the Russian government to shitpost about how the United States is close to collapse. The dollar will be replaced by the ruble. The Western world the days are numbered for the Americas, essentially. And the biggest prediction that they make is that the currency will suddenly devalue and that the economy will start to shrink, and that glorious Russia, the friend of all people apparently that aren't part of the Western sphere, will suddenly jump in and close up these gaps and repair the world economy, and will have peace forever because the glorious, benevolent Russians somehow took over the world and displaced this horrible great Satan that was the United States. The cult of personality aspect around Putin is clear, that he's just another politician, and some people are deluded enough not to see this. I see this even here in the United States with people that are like me. They're cynical towards DC, and they realize DC's all sorts of fucked up. They realize our government's corrupt. It is. They realize there are all sorts of economic problems in this country. And yet, they look at Russia. Most of them have never actually been there. And they say, oh, but Putin's a god man. He's the savior of the Western world somehow. He's a great man. He's far more powerful and charismatic than anyone we have here. I wish we had a Putin over here in the United States. And I say, well, that's delusional. Look at what Putin has largely done to his own economy. Now, part of it's not his fault. Part of it is simply oil prices have just collapsed. The cost of oil is now down by about 50%. Well, yeah, that's about a quarter of the Russian economy has largely gone away. Their exports, anyway. About a quarter of their exports have dried up. The other part is his fault, though, and that's the sanctions. The sanctions on Russia right now are the result of course, the invasion of Crimea. By, let's face it, the Russian military, although Putin keeps denying it, we now know, of course, yes, the Russian military was there all along. The rest of the Ukrainian struggle really has fallen by the wayside, though, because those sanctions have dried up a lot of the economy. And the thing is, Putin lives this is my sort of assessment of Putin's character. He lives under the delusion that Russia is the same now as it was when he was young, when it was the USSR. Back then, Russia was one half of the world. It controlled the Eastern world. China was a solid ally back then before the 1980s with the Gang of Four sort of nonsense. And so he could count on the Chinese to prop him up, to back him. He could count on everything within the Russian sphere. He could count on the Eastern Europeans. He could count on some of the Arabic states. And Russia, thus, under that sort of situation, has a fairly decent number of backers, has a large, potentially, economy, and can trade internally and not really give a damn about the rest of the world. The technology might lag behind, but you've got a large population, a lot of resources. And as long as some of them keep their ports open to the Western world, everything can be funneled through them, and Russia benefits. The thing is, that's not the way the world works anymore. Most of the former Soviet states in Eastern Europe don't like the Russians. The Baltic states are outright hostile towards Russia. Most of the Ukrainians are hostile. Belarus, no. The Central Asian states that used to be part of the Soviet Union largely are ambivalent towards Putin's goals. They're willing to trade. But if you ask the people on the ground, most of them look at it as the Dark Ages, when the Soviets controlled those regions because of their Russification policies, constantly purging native populations and replacing them with white Russians whenever possible. And a lot of these people repatriated into Russia when the USSR collapsed, which is why those groups aren't there today. Some of them stayed. China is no longer a solid ally of the Russians. They're also not a solid ally of anyone else. They are an insular state that has a large enough economy, nuclear weapons and so forth, that they know that as long as they play nice with the Western world, they can keep the trade going and keep their economy growing. They don't care about all of this dick-wagging that Putin does. They would much rather focus upon trying to exercise control over some of the mineral deposits in the Pacific. That's what they're focused on right now. They're willing to buy Putin's natural gas, but then they haggled on the price to the point where Putin, who originally thought he was going to get the Chinese to pay quite a premium for his natural gas, found out suddenly and went back to Russia early, apparently in shame, what everybody else in the world knew, which is that the Chinese no longer require Russia to back them in order to exist as a state. Russia is used to seeing these sort of vassal states within its sphere, largely reliant upon its military prowess, and that Russia in return gets a cut of all of those resources. That's sort of the way business has worked. That's no longer the way things operate. Some of those former Soviet states were completely absorbed into the Western world, and others became powerful on their own, like China. They no longer need Russia. And Putin does not seem to have realized this. He is living in the 1960s, 1970s, when Russia formed the vast core of a sphere of states in the Eastern world that was antagonistic towards and about as powerful as the entire West. But that's not the way things work anymore. Russia no longer has that position. Russia is a power. But Putin seems to think it's the power, at least in that hemisphere, and he's wrong. That's why all of his decisions have been sort of scatterbrained and largely haven't worked. The currency has fallen out completely. The Russian economy now appears to be ready to enter a major recession, literally early next year. And watching this happen, I don't understand why he thought this was a good idea. If he intended to sort of bully around the Western world, the more adequate way to do this is use the fact that Russia does have so much fuel, does have so many mineral resources, to grow its own economy, focus on infrastructure, and then later on, when it's far more powerful, then begin gobbling things back into its sphere. That would have been a brilliant plan. It would have taken decades, but it would have worked. Instead, Putin appears to have gotten impatient and decided that Crimea was more important than rebuilding Russia into an actual stable entity. The problem being the largely monocultured economy that Russia possesses can't really weather these low oil prices without going into recession. And that causes instability, that causes separatists to rise sometimes. It causes protests. We've seen protests now several times in Moscow. And these low oil prices, they don't hurt the Western world. They're not hurting the United States. A couple of our states rely heavily enough on oil to actually see their economies decline when the prices fall. The rest of the states see their economies swiftly grow, more than making up for that loss in places like Alaska or Texas. Why? Because those lower oil prices increase tourism, they increase travel, they lower the prices on other goods, and largely the economy surges ahead when oil prices fall. This is great for the Western world. And ultimately, what's good for the United States tends to be good for most of our allies, because then we can ship our goods to them more cheaply, because they're being produced more cheaply. As for Russia, and some of its allies as well, look at Venezuela. They're entirely reliant almost on oil. And when the Russian ruble collapses to its lowest point since apparently 1998, you know that there's a problem. There's been a severe upset in their economy, and a lot of their investors have left as well. That took even more money with them. Because people had been investing in Russia with the idea that Russia was marginally advanced. I mean, it's not a third world country. It has some technological problems, but it had room for growth because the Russia had stabilized. And it looked like Russia was going to continue to grow for a long period of time because it had that extra room. It has this vast chunk of land that's resource rich. It's capable of extracting. All it had to do was fund infrastructure, do basically what the United States did in the 50s, in the dawn of the Cold War, that improved our own economy. The Russian economy would be twice as large as it is now if they had just put those steps in place a decade ago. And Russia would be very much more wealthy than it is now if they had done so. However, Putin appears to have abandoned these plans, and he proposes this crazy military budget, which would fully modernize and overhaul every aspect of their military, to the point where even before the oil prices collapsed, their own defense minister and their finance minister said, we can't actually fund this whole thing. You're going to have to sort of pick and choose which aspects you want. Now that the oil prices have bottomed out, it looks like they won't get any of their overhauls. They will continue using outdated equipment largely. Other than missile systems, which they've kept modernized. Other than that, they're going to continue using materials that were built in the 80s and 90s. Meanwhile, the Chinese, on the strength of their economy, they are fully modernizing their military forces. Again, probably better for the Western world. The Chinese largely have not been antagonistic towards the West. Anyone that thinks that the Chinese are an up-and-coming military superpower that's trying to take over the world, or are a communist state, which they haven't been again since the 80s, or that they're trying to destroy the United States, doesn't understand the concept of trade, because the United States is the Chinese largest trading partner, and they're not going to do anything to piss us off and see half of their economy suddenly shrivel, especially since U.S. and Western investors employ, I think it is about 50 million people in China. Actually, that number's probably smaller than the real number. And that's a lot of their middle class. Because U.S. firms, even if they pay double the median income, still save money that they would have paid to people here. So that's why the Chinese have absorbed so much investment. No, the Russian economy is not looking good. And Putin could easily take steps to ameliorate this. And it never needed to be a problem in the beginning. Russia would be suffering anyway because oil prices have nothing to do with any decision that he made. But at the same time, those sanctions that have been levied against Russia have had some impact. Now, personally, I think that a lot of that was unnecessary. The oil prices alone have basically stamped out any hopes that Putin would have had of growing his economy substantially and modernizing his military. And even if Russia did modernize its military, what's it going to do with it? What are the Russians supposed to do with 20,000 tanks? Are they going to invade the Baltics and start a nuclear war? I personally don't think so. Putin may be a bit deluded. He may be living in an outdated decade, but he's not a lunatic. I don't think he's crazy enough to press the little red button. If he does, he'd go down in history as the most stupid world leader in world history, since some caveman decided to set the human race back a million years by putting out the fire and clubbing Olaf the caveman over the head who invented it, thus preventing man from mastering flames for an extra million years or something. That would be sort of the equivalent of Putin pressing that little button. But the Russian economy doesn't have to be like this. Putin himself could have overseen the growth of various aspects of that economy. We're talking minerals, which Russia is rich in. Lumber. There's a lot of lumber in Russia. There's a lot of fallow land that is technically agriculturally capable of being worked. All it needs is infrastructure. Putin could have opened these areas up using roads and rails to allow growth in some of these marginal zones that are actually habitable. He could have done that. The Russian population could be quadruple what it is right now, and it would be able to sustain that growth, and Russia would become a superpower. Instead, Russia right now is just a power. It's like Britain, or France, or some of these other empires that collapsed due to their own mistakes and then got fucked. And now they have continual stagnation problems. The French do, the British do, all of these countries do. Russia has them too. But Russia is relatively new on the world stage. It was the USSR until the USSR collapsed. Russia as it exists now is not that old. It's younger than I am. And so Russia still hasn't seemed to learn these sort of lessons about how the modern world works. They seem to be living in this 1960s, 1970s world where they're still one of the two major superpowers, and that's just not the way things are now. They've lost a substantial proportion of their land, a substantial proportion of what had been their population, and they've stagnated since that fall. And as soon as the investors started coming in and started improving life in Russia, and things were looking very much up for them, and people over here were actually worried for a while. They said, well, Russia's economy is growing so much more swiftly, they're going to outpace us eventually. And now it looks like that was all just a pipe dream on behalf of Putin. And people over here, the delusional sort of wannabe Starbucks Marxists, they still have this weird delusion that Russia's a communist country. Russia is not a communist country anymore. Russia is a vaguely liberalized society. It's really more of an oligarchy. It has nothing in common with Russia, the Soviet Union of the 50s or something like that. People seem not to understand this. But yeah, the ruble is collapsing, oil prices have taken a toll, sanctions, Russia is looking down. Now that doesn't mean that necessarily the United States is much better off, but at least our currency hasn't completely and utterly collapsed yet. That's about all.